The season of fall is a time of calm reflection and heartfelt gratitude, a pause between the warmth of summer and the chill of winter. As the air turns crisp and the trees blaze with shades of gold, amber, and crimson, people across America find themselves slowing down to savor the beauty of change. It is during this season that we are reminded to be thankful for the harvests of the earth, for the company of loved ones, and for the simple comforts that fill our lives. The spirit of fall naturally leads to Thanksgiving, one of the most cherished traditions in the United States. Families gather around tables filled with roasted turkey, pumpkin pie, and the warmth of shared stories, echoing the early bonds of community and gratitude that marked the first Thanksgiving centuries ago. As we watch the leaves drift to the ground, we are reminded that endings can be beautiful beginnings, and that gratitude prepares the heart for joy. Tonight's story, The Seeds of Gratitude, unfolds a tale rooted in the history of Thanksgiving. Chapter 1: The Crossing. The wind shrieked like a living thing, tearing at the sails until they sounded like thunderclaps. Elizabeth Tilden braced herself against the wooden railing of the Mayflower and watched the black waves rise and fall beneath her. The sea seemed endless, angry, and ancient, as if it resented their crossing. The air stung her face with salt, but she refused to look away. Somewhere beyond that horizon, she told herself, was land, a place they could call home. She clutched the wool shawl around her shoulders and turned as Samuel, her husband, came up from below deck. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, his hands red from the cold. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, raising his voice over the wind. "The sea's in no mood for company tonight." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "It hasn't been for 60 days. He laughed, a weary sound that warmed her more than the blanket ever could. "True enough." He joined her at the railing, staring out into the darkness. For a while they stood without speaking. The ship creaked and groaned around them, the timbers bending as the waves struck again and again. Beneath their feet, more than 100 passengers huddled together in the hold. Men, women, children, their lives reduced to damp straw and the hope of freedom. The air below deck was thick with sickness, and the cries of infants mixed with the coughs of the dying. Elizabeth had gone down earlier to comfort a young girl whose mother had fallen ill. She'd sung softly until the child drifted to sleep, then lingered there, wondering if she herself had the strength to keep believing this journey had meaning. Now above deck she drew a deep breath of cold air. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "if we'll make it?" Samuel glanced at her, eyes steady. "I wonder every day. But I believe we will." "Because of faith?" "Because of you," he said simply. Her heart caught. It was just the sort of thing he said, earnest and unguarded. Before she could respond, the ship pitched sharply, sending both of them gripping for balance. A wave crashed over the bow, drenching them in icy spray. Samuel pulled her close. "That's enough stargazing for tonight." She didn't argue. Together they climbed below deck, ducking under the low beams into the dim, flickering light of oil lamps. The space reeked of wet wool, sickness, and fear. But it was also filled with whispers of prayer, scraps of song, and the faint, stubborn heartbeat of human will. Elizabeth lay awake long after Samuel had fallen asleep. The ship rolled, timbers groaning as she stared into the darkness. She could hear the ocean slapping against the hull relentlessly, endlessly. In her lap rested a small leather-bound journal. It was the one thing she refused to pack away, a gift from her mother the night before they left England. "Write your truth," her mother had told her. "If the world forgets us, your words will remind it we were here." She opened to a fresh page and began to write, her handwriting swaying with the motion of the ship. November 1620. Somewhere upon the Atlantic. The sea tests us daily. Some say God is with us. Others whisper that he has abandoned us. I do not know which is true. But I know this: faith is not found in comfort. It is found in the choosing, again and again, to believe there will be land even when there is none in sight. Days blurred together after that. Storms came and went. The food grew stale, the water sour. A fever spread through the lower decks, and Elizabeth found herself tending to the sick with what little they had: strips of linen, whispered prayers, and her own determination not to lose another soul. When the storm broke on the 66th day, sunlight spilled across the deck for the first time in weeks. The air smelled of salt and possibility. "Land!" someone shouted. Elizabeth stumbled up the ladder and emerged into a world transformed. The sky was the color of pewter, and far off, beyond the foaming waves, a line of dark green cut across the horizon. "Land." She gripped Samuel's hand so tightly he laughed. "We've made it," he said. The crew shouted orders. Passengers cried and prayed and fell to their knees. Elizabeth felt tears sting her own eyes as she whispered a single word: "Thank you." It wasn't yet the feast of Thanksgiving, but that moment, she would later write, was her first prayer of true gratitude. The next morning they came ashore. The wind was sharp, filled with the scent of pine and frost. The sand crunched beneath her boots as Elizabeth stepped onto the new world for the first time. Samuel knelt beside her and scooped a handful of earth, letting it run through his fingers. "Strange," he said. "It looks just like home." "Maybe that's what makes it ours," she replied. The others were already unloading supplies, shouting and laughing as they dragged barrels and crates across the beach. There was no time to celebrate, only to survive. But for a few moments, Elizabeth allowed herself to look around, to breathe in the vastness of it all. The trees stood silent and watchful. Somewhere beyond them, unseen eyes might be watching too. She felt both exhilarated and small, a single life in an endless new world. That night they built fires and huddled close against the cold. The stars were brighter here, unfamiliar constellations scattered across the sky. Samuel took her hand. "Tomorrow we start building," he said. "A home. A life." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think we'll be happy here?" He was quiet for a long time. "Happiness isn't something you find, Lizzie. It's something you build, one board at a time." She smiled because that was Samuel, a man who saw the world as a project waiting to be crafted. As the firelight flickered across his face, she made herself a promise. She would write it all down, the hope, the hunger, the heartache, so that their story would not be forgotten. She didn't yet know the price the winter would demand, or how gratitude, born from grief, would one day become the heartbeat of a nation. The cold came fast. By December, frost clung to every surface, and the wind from the bay cut through layers of wool and faith alike. They built shelters slowly, rough wooden houses with smoke leaking from the roofs and snow piling against the doors. Every board was a battle, every nail driven with shaking hands. Elizabeth worked beside Samuel when she could, her breath visible in the air, her fingers stiff and raw. She had never imagined that survival could feel so physical, so heavy with the weight of each breath. At night, she wrote by the light of a tallow candle. "This land is both beautiful and cruel. The trees are tall and silent. The air smells of pine and smoke. Sometimes I think the world here is too large for us. We are small things trying to make a mark before the wind blows us away. Each morning brought new graves on the hill beyond the settlement. They buried them in silence, using stones to mark the names until the snow covered even that. Samuel would return from digging with frost clinging to his beard, his eyes distant. 6 more today, he told her once, voice hollow. Half the women in the lower houses are gone. Elizabeth said nothing. She couldn't. Instead she took his hand, pressed it to her cheek and whispered, "We are still here." He nodded, but his gaze drifted toward the horizon, where gray clouds hung like ghosts. Inside their small shelter, Elizabeth did what she could to keep the others warm. She shared bread, sang softly to frightened children, and boiled snow in a pot that never seemed to stay full. At night she would lie awake and listen to the ocean crashing in the distance. It sounded like the heartbeat of something ancient, something that didn't care whether they lived or died. And yet, in those long hours of darkness, she began to understand what faith truly meant. Not certainty, not miracles, just the quiet decision to keep believing that spring would come. One evening, as a blizzard screamed outside, a knock sounded on their door. Samuel opened it to find William Bradford, his face pale with exhaustion. "Elizabeth," he said, "we need you in the common house. There are sick who need tending." She pulled her shawl tighter and followed him through the snow. Inside the dim, smoky shelter, bodies lay huddled beneath blankets, feverish, trembling, coughing. She knelt beside a woman whose skin burned with fever. Elizabeth dipped a cloth into cold water and pressed it gently to the woman's forehead. "You'll be all right," she whispered. The woman's eyes flickered open. "How can you be sure?" Elizabeth hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Because we have to be." It wasn't a promise she could keep. By morning the woman was gone. Weeks passed. Hunger gnawed at them all. They rationed every crumb, melting snow for water and praying for warmth. But even then, especially then, Elizabeth found reasons to be thankful. For the rare days when the sun broke through the clouds. For the sound of Samuel's hammer against wood, proof that he still believed in the future. For the child she carried, who kicked softly beneath her heart as if reminding her that life would not be extinguished so easily. When she felt despair creeping close, she wrote, "Perhaps gratitude is not born from comfort but from endurance. Each morning I wake and draw breath, and that must be enough." By March the snow began to melt. Thin blades of green pushed through the earth, fragile and new. The settlers emerged from their cabins like survivors of a siege. One morning, while Elizabeth was hanging linen to dry, a shout came from the edge of the clearing. "Stranger!" someone cried. Men grabbed muskets, forming a line, but the figure that approached raised a single hand in peace. His skin was darker than theirs, his clothing made from animal hides. His eyes, calm and watchful, studied them with quiet intelligence. "Welcome," he said in clear English. The settlers froze. No one had expected to be greeted in their own tongue. "My name is Samoset," he said. "I come from the Wampanoag." Bradford stepped forward cautiously. "You speak English?" Samoset nodded. "A little. From fishermen." He smiled faintly. "You are hungry." The honesty of it struck Elizabeth like a blow. Before anyone could stop her, she stepped forward. "Yes," she said softly. "We are." Samoset's gaze met hers, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of shared humanity beyond fear. He nodded once. "Then we will bring food." That evening, Samoset returned with another man, Squanto they called him, who spoke the language fluently. He told them of his people, of the land, of the fish and corn that could feed them. He showed them how to plant seed with fish buried beneath for strength, how to find herbs that healed, and how to read the signs of the seasons. Samuel was wary at first. "How can we trust them?" he whispered to Elizabeth. "Because we must," she answered. "Because this land has room for more than fear." By the time spring came in full, the settlement had changed. Fields stretched where snow once lay. Children laughed again. Smoke from the hearths rose like prayers into clear blue sky. Elizabeth felt her belly swell and her heart with it. The child within her was strong, a promise of what this new world might yet hold. On the first warm night of the season, she and Samuel walked to the edge of the water. The moon reflected off the bay, silver and endless. "Do you think we'll ever stop feeling like strangers here?" she asked. Samuel thought for a long time before answering. "Maybe we're not meant to. Maybe being strangers is what keeps us humble." She smiled. "Then I'll be humble all my days." They stood together in silence, the waves whispering at their feet. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called, and for the first time since crossing the ocean, Elizabeth felt at peace. She didn't know what would come next. The feast, the years of hardship, the stories that would outlive them. But she knew this moment mattered. Gratitude, she thought, is not the absence of pain. It's the courage to love the world anyway. Chapter 2: The Meeting of Worlds. The world turned green again. After months of gray, the thaw came quickly, snow giving way to trickling streams, and then to the rush of water running through the hollows of the land. The trees budded like promises kept, and the scent of earth filled the air. Elizabeth stood outside her cabin one morning, hands resting on her swollen belly, and listened to the world wake up. Somewhere nearby, Samuel was hammering boards into the frame of a new storehouse. The rhythmic sound comforted her. It meant that life was returning, steady, deliberate, and real. She could still remember every face they'd buried that winter. The weight of that grief hadn't vanished, but now it lived alongside something else. A stubborn kind of joy. The survivors had become family, bound not by blood but by endurance. She felt a sudden kick and smiled. "You hear that?" she murmured to the child. "That's the sound of your father making a future." The door opened behind her. Samuel stepped out, his face flushed from work, a smudge of sawdust in his beard. "Talking to yourself again?" "To both of us," she corrected, touching her belly. He grinned and kissed her forehead. "Then tell both of you to stay out of trouble while I fetch water." Later that afternoon, Elizabeth joined several of the women near the fields where the men and Squanto were planting. She carried a basket of seed and watched as Squanto guided them. His movements were patient and sure, his voice calm. "You dig here," he said, pointing with a stick. "Then fish, small ones, into the hole. Corn seed above. The fish feeds the plant." Samuel crouched beside him, following every motion. "Fish is fertilizer," he said, shaking his head. "Who would have thought?" Squanto smiled faintly. "The land tells you how to live if you listen." Elizabeth felt herself smiling too. His words carried a wisdom that seemed older than the ocean itself. She knelt beside a row of soil, pressing seeds into the earth. The sun was warm on her face, and for the first time in many months she hummed while she worked. A week later she met Neshoba. Elizabeth had gone to the edge of the clearing to gather herbs when she saw movement among the trees. a woman of the Wampanoag carrying a woven basket on her back. For a heartbeat they only stared at each other. Then Neshoba lifted her hand, palm open in peace. Elizabeth hesitated, then mirrored the gesture. "Hello," she said softly. The woman tilted her head, studying her. "Hello," she echoed, the word careful but sure. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them fragile as spun glass. Then Neshoba stepped forward and crouched beside a patch of green plants. She plucked a few leaves and held them out. "Good for fever," she said. Elizabeth recognized the shape. She'd seen Squanto use the same herb weeks before. She accepted it gently. "Thank you." Neshoba smiled and pointed to herself. "Neshoba." "Elizabeth," she replied. "Liz." "Liz," Neshoba repeated, nodding. It was a simple exchange, but something in it felt larger. A door opening between two worlds. After that, they met often near the edge of the woods. Neshoba taught Elizabeth to recognize the wild plants that healed. Willow bark for pain, mint for nausea, yarrow for bleeding. In return, Elizabeth showed her how to make bread from ground corn and wheat, and once even shared a scrap of parchment so Neshoba could see how the English wrote their words. As weeks passed, the corn began to grow, the stalks stretching high toward the sun. Birds returned, filling the forest with song. Children laughed again. The settlement, once filled with the sound of coughing and sorrow, now rang with the rhythm of work and the murmur of new friendships. Not all welcomed these changes. At the evening meal one night, John Billington, a man quick to anger and quicker to speak, muttered loud enough for all to hear, "We rely too much on them. The natives watch us, mark my words. They'll turn on us when it suits them." Elizabeth felt the air tighten around the table. Samuel set down his spoon. "They saved our lives," he said evenly. Billington scoffed. "For now." "Enough," Governor Bradford said firmly. "We are guests in this land. Best remember that." The conversation ended, but the unease lingered. Elizabeth lay awake that night, listening to the wind outside, and wondered if gratitude would always have to live beside fear. The days grew longer, and with the sun came something like peace. The colonists had finished building their meeting house, and the fields, so recently barren, were alive with green. Corn sprouted in tidy rows, beans climbing their poles, pumpkins sprawling over the soft brown earth. Every seed was a prayer answered. Elizabeth spent many mornings outside, hands deep in the soil, beside Neshoba. The Wampanoag woman worked quietly, her motions steady and sure. Her dark hair was braided back, her tunic made of deerskin, and her eyes held a patient light that Elizabeth came to rely on. At first their conversations were simple, gestures and shared smiles. But as Elizabeth learned new words, their talks grew deeper. One morning, as they planted together, Elizabeth brushed a stray hair from her face and asked, "What do you call this season?" Neshoba glanced up from her work. "Peskiomskit. Time when plants begin to stand tall." Elizabeth repeated it carefully. "Peskiomskit." Neshoba laughed softly. "Good. You speak better each day." Elizabeth smiled. "Only because you're kind enough to teach me." "You listen," Neshoba said. "That is rare." Later that day, as they rested in the shade, Elizabeth offered Neshoba a piece of hard bread. Neshoba took it politely, though she smiled wryly at its toughness. "Your bread fights the teeth," she teased. Elizabeth laughed. "You're not wrong. We've all broken a tooth or two on it. Neshoba reached into her woven pouch and handed Elizabeth a handful of dried berries. Try this. Elizabeth tasted one, surprised by its sweetness. It's delicious. Saismanash. Cranberries, Neshoba said. We dry them for winter. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps we could trade. Bread for berries. Perhaps, Neshoba said, her eyes glinting. But next time softer bread. In the weeks that followed, the two women met often. Sometimes in the fields, sometimes by the shore where they gathered mussels or watched the tide roll in. Elizabeth marveled at how easily Neshoba moved through the world, as if she belonged to every part of it. You know the names of every plant, Elizabeth said one afternoon. How did you learn so much? My mother taught me, Neshoba replied. And her mother before her. We learn by doing, by listening. You learn the same way with your child, yes. Elizabeth's hand went unconsciously to her stomach, where life stirred beneath her palm. Yes. Though I suppose I'm still learning how to be a mother. Neshoba studied her quietly. The world will teach you. It always does. There was comfort in that, more than Elizabeth expected. The men, however, were slower to trust. Though they traded with the Wampanoag, suspicions still lingered. Samuel would often return from council meetings tense and silent. What troubles you? Elizabeth asked one evening as she stirred the fire. He rubbed his temples. We rely too much on them, he said. What if they tire of helping us? What if one day they decide we don't belong here? Elizabeth turned toward him. And if we decide the same? Then we'd be no better. Samuel frowned. You sound as though you've chosen a side. I've chosen gratitude, she said quietly. Without them we wouldn't have survived the winter. Without them there would be no harvest to tend. He looked at her then, really looked, and sighed. You're right. I just fear what I don't understand. Then understand it, she said gently. Come to the fields. Speak to Neshoba. Listen. He didn't answer right away, but she saw the resolve soften in his eyes. A week later Samuel did join them. He stood awkwardly at first, watching as Neshoba demonstrated how to catch eels using woven traps. When one squirmed free and splashed into the mud, Neshoba laughed. A clear, joyful sound, and Samuel laughed too, surprised by his own amusement. By sunset he and Neshoba were speaking in halting words and gestures, sharing stories neither fully understood but both enjoyed. Elizabeth watched, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Later that night Samuel admitted, she's clever. Knows more about this land than we ever will. Elizabeth smiled. And she shares that knowledge freely. He nodded slowly. Then maybe we've been the ones keeping walls where there should be bridges. One evening, as summer settled over the colony, Elizabeth and Neshoba sat by the shore, watching the fireflies blink above the marshes. The air was thick with the scent of pine and salt water. Neshoba spoke softly. My people call this place Patuxet. Long ago it was full of voices. Children playing, women cooking, men fishing. Then sickness came from across the water. Many died. Too many. Elizabeth's chest tightened. I'm sorry, she said, though the words felt small. Neshoba nodded slowly. It is not your fault. But it is our memory. Elizabeth hesitated. Do you hate us for being here? Neshoba looked at her for a long moment, then shook her head. Hate wastes life. I see you trying to live, to learn. That is enough. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes. You've shown us kindness when you had every reason not to. Neshoba's gaze softened. Perhaps your child will grow in both worlds. Then maybe kindness will grow with them. The thought stayed with Elizabeth long after she returned home. When autumn came, the fields were heavy with corn and squash, and the forests teemed with game. The settlement, once on the edge of despair, now buzzed with laughter and relief. William Bradford called a meeting of the colony. "We have much to be thankful for," he said, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "Let us invite our friends, the Wampanoag, to share in a feast of gratitude." Elizabeth's heart leapt at the words. It was more than celebration, it was acknowledgement. When she told Neshoba the next morning, the woman smiled. "We will come," she said simply, "and we will bring our own gifts." Chapter 3. The First Feast. The air smelled of wood smoke and ripening corn. Autumn had settled over the settlement like a warm blanket, and for the first time since their arrival, Elizabeth felt that the land itself seemed to smile upon them. Everywhere she looked there was color, gold leaves, red berries, pumpkins glowing in the sun. The fields they had planted in hope now stood full and tall. It felt like a miracle, though she knew it had come from the sweat of every hand, English and Wampanoag alike. The settlers spoke of the feast in excited tones, but for Elizabeth, it was something deeper. It was a reckoning, a way to remember those who hadn't survived to see it. Every loaf she baked, every kernel she laid aside felt like a tribute to them. As she worked, the child inside her stirred. She smiled faintly, pressing a hand to her belly. "You'll be here soon," she whispered. "And I'll tell you how your first home was built from hope and hunger." Samuel ducked into their small cabin, his arms full of wood. "Bradford says we'll start the feast in 3 days," he said, setting the bundle down. "He wants it to last through the weekend." 3 days. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Do we even have enough food for that?" Samuel grinned. "Between us and the Wampanoag, we'll have more than enough. They're bringing venison, and the men are going hunting at dawn tomorrow." Elizabeth laughed softly. "Then I'd better start baking." He walked over and kissed her forehead. "Don't overdo it. You're carrying enough weight already." "I'm pregnant, Samuel, not fragile," she teased. "Go fetch water before I change my mind about that smile." He chuckled as he left, the door creaking behind him. Later that evening, Elizabeth joined Neshoba near the edge of the clearing. The Wampanoag woman was weaving a mat from reeds, her fingers deft and quick. "The men say the feast will last 3 suns," Neshoba said without looking up. "It is good to celebrate. We do the same after harvest." Elizabeth knelt beside her. "How do your people celebrate?" "With song and dance. With food shared among all. Sometimes the stories last all night, tales of ancestors, of spirits, of how the corn first came to us." Elizabeth smiled wistfully. "We tell stories too, though ours are often about survival and faith. Faith is a story we tell ourselves to keep walking forward," Neshoba said. "Yours, mine, they are not so different." Elizabeth was silent for a moment. "Sometimes I wonder if we deserve this peace. After so much loss." Neshoba tied off the reed and looked at her. "Peace is not deserved. It is chosen." The words settled into Elizabeth's heart like seeds in soil. The next morning the colony stirred before dawn. Men took to the woods with muskets and bows, while others gathered apples and nuts. The Wampanoag arrived by midday, bringing baskets of maize, smoked fish, and woven mats. Children ran through the clearing, their laughter echoing between the trees. Elizabeth stood at the center of it all, her apron dusted with flour, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat. As the day warmed, she and Neshoba worked side by side again, preparing corn cakes and stews. Neshoba stirred the pot and grinned. "Your people cook slow." Elizabeth laughed. "And yours don't waste time. Between us, maybe we'll find the right pace." They exchanged a look, one of shared exhaustion but also pride. When the hunters returned that afternoon, they carried wild fowl and deer, their faces flushed with triumph. Samuel approached Elizabeth, grinning. "You should have seen Bradford try to shoot. Nearly scared the birds back to the sea." She shook her head, smiling. "I'll save him the smallest piece of pie for that." He leaned close, lowering his voice. "He'd deserve it." Elizabeth nudged him playfully. "Go wash before you touch anything. You smell like half the forest." He caught her hand and kissed her knuckles. "And you smell like home." She blushed, laughing as she pulled away. By dusk, the clearing glowed with firelight. Long tables had been set up, their surfaces covered with everything they could gather. Roasted venison, wild turkey, corn, squash, dried berries, and steaming bread. The smell of it all mingled in the air, rich and comforting. Bradford raised a hand for silence. The murmurs faded. "My friends," he began, his voice deep with emotion, "when we came to this place, we did not know if we would live to see another spring. But we have endured, not alone but together. Let us give thanks to God and to our neighbors for the blessings before us." He gestured toward Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, who nodded solemnly. "We share the land," Massasoit said through Squanto's translation. "The earth gives enough for both peoples. Let this be remembered." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Elizabeth looked around, the firelight dancing on every face, English and Wampanoag laughter and song mingling in the cool air. For the first time since she had stepped onto this foreign shore, she felt that perhaps they truly belonged. She leaned toward Neshoba and whispered, "We'll remember this day." Neshoba's eyes sparkled in the firelight. "Yes. And tell the story when we are old." Elizabeth smiled. "Then we'd better make it a good story." That night, as music and laughter carried into the dark, Elizabeth felt a sudden tightening in her belly. She paused, gripping the edge of the table. Samuel, noticing her stillness, hurried over. "Elizabeth? What is it?" She exhaled, eyes wide. "I think it's time." "Chow?" he asked, alarmed. She nodded, smiling through the pain. "Seems our child didn't want to miss the feast." Neshoba was at her side in an instant. "Come," she said firmly. "We go inside." Inside their small cabin, the sounds of celebration drifted faintly through the walls. Laughter, drums, and the hum of voices. Neshoba boiled water while Samuel held Elizabeth's hand, his face pale but determined. Hours passed. The pain came in waves, and Elizabeth's world narrowed to breath, to heat, to the steady rhythm of life insisting on being born. Then, as dawn broke over the treetops, a baby's cry filled the air. Samuel let out a trembling laugh of relief. "It's a boy," he whispered. Neshoba smiled, wrapping the child in soft linen. "Strong voice," she said approvingly. "He will be a storyteller." Elizabeth took the baby in her arms, tears of exhaustion and joy spilling down her cheeks. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "You came just in time to give thanks." When they stepped outside later that morning, the feast was still going strong. Word spread quickly and the colonists cheered. Neshoba lifted her chin proudly. "See," she said to the gathered crowd. "The feast brings new life." Bradford approached with a broad smile. Then this child is the firstborn of our harvest season. A blessing indeed. Elizabeth looked around at the faces surrounding her. Friends, neighbors, the Wampanoag who had saved them, Samuel beaming beside her, and felt a fullness that words couldn't reach. For the first time, gratitude wasn't just something she spoke. It lived, breathing and warm in her arms. Morning sunlight spilled over the settlement, catching on smoke from dying embers and turning the world gold. The sounds of laughter and footsteps drifted between cabins. Someone was already roasting corn. Someone else was tuning a fiddle. Elizabeth sat outside with her newborn cradled against her chest, watching as Samuel carved small sticks for the fire. The baby slept, his tiny hand curled around her finger. "He looks like you," Samuel said, smiling softly. Elizabeth shook her head. "You think every child looks like their father." "Well," he said, leaning closer, "this one really does. Strong nose. Serious brow." She laughed quietly. "If he gets your stubbornness too, we're doomed." "I'll take that as a compliment." The colony buzzed with purpose that morning. Men gathered to repair tables toppled by wind in the night. Women reheated stews and baked more loaves. Children ran back and forth, shouting greetings to the Wampanoag families who arrived bearing baskets of fruit and smoked meat. Massasoit himself came, carrying a carved wooden bowl filled with roasted corn. He bowed slightly toward Elizabeth, who sat with the child in her arms. "Your son brings good fortune," he said through Squanto's translation. "He came when the people shared food and peace. That is a sign." Elizabeth smiled, touched by the sentiment. "Then we will name him Jonathan," she said. "It means gift." Massasoit nodded. "Then may your gift grow strong." He turned and joined the others at the long tables, his warriors laughing and calling out in greeting to the settlers. Neshoba arrived soon after, her braid gleaming in the morning light. She knelt beside Elizabeth and gazed at the baby. "He is beautiful," she said softly. "Strong lungs, strong spirit. He will walk both paths, yours and mine." Elizabeth looked up, surprised. "You think so?" Neshoba nodded. "He was born between two worlds. That is a powerful beginning." Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. "Then maybe he'll help them understand each other better than we ever could." "Perhaps that is his story to tell," Neshoba said with a small smile. As the feast resumed, the settlement transformed into a living celebration. English and Wampanoag voices mingled in laughter and song. Music filled the air, a rough blend of drumbeats and fiddle tunes, somehow perfectly in tune. The scent of food drifted everywhere. Venison stew thick with herbs, roasted fowl stuffed with cornmeal, freshly baked bread, and sweet berries simmering into jam. Children danced between the tables while older men told stories. Bradford recounting their voyage across the sea, and Wampanoag elders speaking of the Great Spirit who watches over the harvest. Squanto sat near the fire, gesturing animatedly as he told both groups a story about how crows learned to speak. The settlers laughed at his lively expressions. The Wampanoag joined in with cheers at the punchline. For a rare moment the world felt whole. That afternoon Elizabeth felt well enough to join the crowd. She carried Jonathan carefully, wrapped in a soft shawl. When she reached the long tables, a hush fell briefly, then cheers erupted. Bradford rose to greet her. "Elizabeth, you bring the truest blessing to this feast. New life among us." She smiled humbly, her cheeks flushed. "I only did the easy part. He did the rest." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Neshoba came forward with a small woven charm, beads and feathers tied with sinew. "This is for him," she said. "Protection from sickness and ill spirits." Elizabeth accepted it reverently. "Thank you. I'll keep it close." Neshoba fastened it gently to the shawl. "Now he carries a piece of both worlds." As the sun dipped lower, the games began. Foot races, archery contests, even a friendly tug-of-war between the Englishmen and the Wampanoag hunters. Samuel joined one of the races, his boots thudding across the packed earth. He came in second, laughing breathlessly as Neshoba's younger brother claimed victory with a triumphant whoop. "I let him win," Samuel said, trying to catch his breath. Neshoba smirked. "Of course you did." "Truly," Samuel said. "I'm a generous loser." Bradford chuckled from nearby. "If generosity looked like that, we'd all be saints." Elizabeth laughed so hard she had to steady Jonathan, who blinked up at her in confusion before settling back to sleep. That evening the final fire was lit, a great flame that painted the clearing in gold and crimson. The people gathered in a wide circle. Squanto stood and spoke first. "This fire is for all who came before, those who did not live to see the harvest. We remember them and we thank them." Bradford followed, his tone solemn but warm. "And we thank those who taught us how to live upon this land. May we never forget that our survival was not ours alone." Elizabeth's heart swelled. She thought of the bitter cold of their first winter, the graves marked only with stones, the endless hunger. And she thought of this: warmth, laughter, the scent of food and pine, the small heartbeat resting against her chest. It felt like grace. Neshoba took up a drum and began a steady rhythm. The beat echoed through the clearing, slow and deep, like the pulse of the earth. Soon others joined in, flutes, fiddles, voices rising together. Elizabeth didn't know the words to their songs, but she felt them. The language of gratitude needed no translation. As the stars wheeled overhead, she turned to Samuel. "Do you think our children will remember this?" He nodded slowly. "Maybe not the details, but I hope they'll remember the feeling. That even after everything, people can choose kindness." She leaned against him, Jonathan warm in her arms. "Then let that be what we pass on." When the fire burned low and the drums softened to silence, Elizabeth whispered a quiet prayer to herself. "For the land that holds us. For the friends who taught us. For the love that binds us. Let every harvest remind us, we are never alone." The feast lasted 3 days as Bradford had promised. When it ended, the Wampanoag packed their baskets, the settlers cleaned the fields, and the air grew cooler with the coming of winter. But something had changed. They were no longer strangers on opposite shores of understanding. They were part of a shared story, one that began with hunger and ended, at least for now, with hope. That night, as Elizabeth rocked Jonathan to sleep, the moon shone bright through the cabin window. She whispered to him softly, "One day they'll tell stories about this, about how we gave thanks and how we learned to share what we had. Maybe they'll even call it a holiday." She smiled faintly, her voice a lullaby. "And maybe they'll remember that it all began here, with kindness, courage, and a meal shared between friends." Jonathan sighed in his sleep, a tiny sound of peace. Elizabeth kissed his forehead and whispered one final word before the fire went out. "Thanksgiving." Chapter 4. The Changing Seasons. The world had grown larger. Years had passed since the first harvest, since that strange and tender feast where strangers had broken bread beneath a pale autumn sky. Now Plymouth was no longer a fragile cluster of timber huts clinging to the edge of the wilderness. It was a town, a living thing that breathed with the rhythm of families, trade, and the endless turning of seasons. Elizabeth Tilden stood in the doorway of her home, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. The morning sun caught in her graying hair. The fields beyond the town shimmered gold with ripened wheat, bending in the wind like waves. Children's laughter drifted up from the road, her grandchildren, playing where she had once stood in fear of the unknown. The world no longer frightened her. It humbled her. She still kept her husband's Bible on the mantel, though its leather was cracked and the ink faded. Between its pages, pressed flat by time, lay a few wildflowers from that first spring after the sickness, the year the Wampanoag had shown them how to live from the land. Every year she added one more, a new bloom, a new reminder that life persisted. At night she sometimes wrote by candlelight. Her handwriting had softened with age, her thoughts wandering like the wind. But she wrote still, letters to her children, notes for those who might someday read them. We have learned that gratitude is not born from plenty, but from the remembrance of mercy. When the world feels cruel and uncertain, we gather and we give thanks because we must. Her eldest son Jonathan had moved inland, chasing fertile land and the dream of his own homestead. His letters came folded and weathered, smelling faintly of pine and smoke. "Mother," he wrote, "the land is good here. We built a cabin near the river. Sarah sends her love and the children are strong. The winters are harsh, but we remember what you taught us, to endure and to thank God for every sunrise." Elizabeth smiled when she read his words, even as her hands trembled. She missed the sea, the cries of gulls, the whisper of tide against sand. But she found peace in knowing her children carried that same quiet faith into the wild. The seasons turned. The colony grew. There were more ships, more settlers, more voices, more divisions. Some came seeking freedom, others fortune. Yet every year when the harvest came, the people gathered. The faces changed, the prayers varied, but the heart of it remained the same. Gratitude, that she realized was their truest inheritance. When Elizabeth passed, her eldest daughter, Mary, found the small journal tucked beneath the Bible. The pages were filled with ink and time, reflections, fragments of poetry, recipes, weather notes, names of births and deaths. Mary read it often, especially during the long winters when the wind howled through the cracks in the shutters. The words were simple, but they carried the warmth of a life well lived. "The land and its people must learn to breathe together," one line read. "The earth gives, the heart receives. We give thanks not because life is easy, but because it is shared." Mary taught her children to read from that same journal. It became a family relic, passed from one generation to the next, carried westward as the colonies expanded, surviving storms, wars, and the slow forgetting that time brings. By the time the journal reached the 1800s, its cover was threadbare, its pages brittle as autumn leaves. But still the words lived on. Virginia, 1863. The battlefield smelled of smoke and damp earth. Private Caleb Tilden, a Union soldier, sat near a dying fire, the glow flickering against the hard plains of his face. He was 23 years old and had not seen his home in 2 years. His uniform was torn, his boots caked in mud, and his heart felt as if it carried the weight of 1,000 ghosts. In his breast pocket, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather book, the journal of his ancestor Elizabeth Tilden of Plymouth. He had found it months ago in his mother's attic before leaving Massachusetts to enlist. It had been tucked among old linens, forgotten, until his sister had said softly, "You should take this. You might need her words where you're going." And he had. Now, under the dim light of a dying moon, he opened it again. The pages were delicate, the ink faded, but the words seemed to burn with quiet strength. When the world feels cruel and uncertain, we gather and we give thanks because we must. Caleb smiled faintly, a ghost of warmth in the cold night. Around him, the camp murmured with weary men, some writing letters home, others staring into the fire as if searching for their past lives in the embers. He pulled his coat tighter, reading on. "We have learned to be grateful not for what we have, but for what endures. Gratitude is the breath between storms." He whispered the words under his breath. They sounded like a prayer, though he wasn't sure he believed in any God that allowed what he had seen these past months. At dawn, his regiment would march again, toward another skirmish, another uncertain horizon. But tonight, for a fleeting moment, he felt tethered to something larger than war. He was part of a story that began long before him. A story written in hunger and courage, in faith and forgiveness. 2 days later, a messenger rode into camp with news. A letter from Washington. The men gathered around as their captain read aloud. By the President of the United States of America. A proclamation. The year that is drawing toward its close has been filled with blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. It has seemed to me fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged. I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November as a day of thanksgiving and praise. There was silence at first, then a ripple of murmurs through the weary ranks. A national day of thanks in the midst of war. Some scoffed. Others bowed their heads. Caleb stood apart, the words echoing through him like something remembered rather than newly spoken. Thanksgiving. He thought of Elizabeth. Of her trembling handwriting in that fragile book. Of her words about gratitude in hardship, not in ease. Maybe Lincoln hadn't known her name, but somehow he had carried the same truth she had once written by candlelight in a world just beginning. That night, rain swept over the camp in thin gray sheets. The men huddled beneath their coats, their fires sputtering out. Caleb sat in the tent doorway, watching lightning crawl across the horizon. He opened the journal again, careful not to let the pages get wet. He could almost see her, the woman from 2 centuries past, standing by the sea with wind in her hair, whispering prayers into the salt air. Her world had been one of beginnings, his one of endings. Yet they both clung to the same fragile thread, gratitude. He dipped his pen into a small tin of ink and began to write on the back of one of her pages, the words trembling slightly as the rain tapped the canvas above him. To whoever reads this, know that I have carried her words through smoke and thunder, through loss and fear. She wrote of gathering, of thanks, of peace between worlds. I write now in a world divided, praying that we will find our way back to hers. He paused, looking out into the storm. We will gather again, he wrote at last. We will give thanks as she once did. He folded the journal closed, pressed it against his chest, and closed his eyes. In the distance, thunder rolled, softly at first, then fading into silence. And through that silence, it was almost as if he could hear her voice again, carried across centuries. The land and its people must learn to breathe together. Chapter 5. A New Thanksgiving. The first snow of November fell softly over Massachusetts, blanketing the quiet streets of Amherst in a thin white hush. Inside a small craftsman house on Elm Street, the kitchen lights glowed warm against the gathering dusk. Anna Tilden stirred the gravy with one hand and reached for her phone with the other, checking for the latest text from her brother, Ben. "Running late. Don't start without me. Bring pie." She smiled. "As if we'd ever wait for pie," she murmured to herself. The scent of rosemary and roasted vegetables filled the air. The table was already set. Porcelain plates that had belonged to their grandmother, cloth napkins folded neatly, a single candle waiting to be lit. On the mantel sat something older still, a small leather-bound book with a cracked spine and the faintest trace of sea salt in its pages. The Tilden Journal. It had survived ship crossings, wars, relocations, attic dust, and the occasional enthusiastic child with sticky fingers. Every Thanksgiving, someone in the family would take it down, open to a random page and read aloud. No one remembered exactly when that tradition began, only that it had always been so. Anna was 34, a high school history teacher who had grown used to explaining the contradictions of the past. How heroism and cruelty often shared the same skin, how progress was never clean or simple. But every Thanksgiving, the story of her ancestor Elizabeth Tilden stirred something in her that no textbook could. Her grandmother had told her that Elizabeth's words were a promise written across time. Anna hadn't understood what that meant as a child. Now she thought she did. Her students asked her once if she thought Thanksgiving was still worth celebrating, given the painful truths of early America. She told them yes, but differently. "It's not about pretending the past was perfect," she'd said. "It's about remembering that gratitude is what kept people human when the world fell apart." She thought of that now as she basted the turkey, the oven fogging her glasses. The world hadn't stopped falling apart. It had just changed its shape. Outside, cars moved slowly through slush. News headlines on her phone scrolled endlessly. Division, conflict, loss, noise. But in this small house there was quiet. A fragile, necessary quiet. Ben arrived just after 6, stamping snow from his boots. He was taller than Anna remembered, he always was, and carried a grocery bag in one hand and a grin in the other. "Traffic was a nightmare," he said, setting down the pie. "But hey, made it before the turkey coma." Their mother, Margaret, laughed from the living room. "You always time your entrance with uncanny precision, Benjamin." "Tradition," he said, dropping his coat. When they finally sat, the room hummed with warmth. Candles flickered. Glasses clinked. The youngest cousins squirmed in their seats, whispering conspiratorially about who would get the wishbone this year. At the head of the table, Margaret lifted the old journal and smiled. "Shall we?" Everyone nodded. She opened to a page near the middle, the paper thin as pressed leaves. Her voice softened as she read. "We give thanks not because we are whole but because we endure. Gratitude is the bridge between what was lost and what remains." The room fell still. Even the children quieted, sensing the weight of the moment. Anna felt it too, an echo that reached through centuries, through seas and wars and generations of Tildens who had lived and struggled and somehow still gathered. After dinner, as the others lingered over dessert and laughter, Anna wandered back to the mantel. She picked up the journal, turning its delicate pages with careful fingers. Between 2 entries, one dated 1623, the other nearly 2 centuries later, she found something she'd never noticed before. A folded scrap of paper, yellowed but still legible. It was a letter. She read it aloud, softly, as if afraid the words might vanish. "To whoever reads this, know that I have carried her words through smoke and thunder, through loss and fear." She wrote of gathering, of thanks, of peace between worlds. I write now in a world divided, praying that we will find our way back to hers. We will gather again. We will give thanks as she once did. Caleb Tilden, 1863. Anna's breath caught. She'd heard of Caleb. There was a faded photo of him in her grandmother's hallway, a bearded young man in a Union uniform, but she'd never seen his words. She ran her fingers across the ink, feeling the faint groove of each letter. Somewhere beyond the snow and the noise and the centuries she felt him, felt all of them. When the guests had gone and the dishes were washed, Anna carried the journal upstairs. She sat on her bed, window cracked open to the cold night air. Outside the snow had stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. She opened to the very first page, the one that had begun it all. The earth gives, the heart receives. We give thanks not because life is easy but because it is shared. Elizabeth's handwriting was faint but steady. It didn't sound like an old woman's voice. It sounded timeless. Anna thought about her ancestor by the firelight, struggled to survive in the unknown and harsh land, still finding the courage to write about gratitude. She thought about Caleb hunched in his tent with war raging around him, still believing in Thanksgiving. And now here she was in a world different but no less fragile, still trying to make sense of what it meant to be thankful. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ben. Good dinners. Thanks for keeping the tradition alive. She smiled and typed back. Always. Then she picked up a pen. On the last blank page of the journal she began to write. The world has changed again. We are louder, busier, more scattered. But tonight we gathered. We gave thanks, not for perfection but for each other. And that, I think, is what she meant all along. She closed the journal gently and placed it back on her nightstand. Outside, the town was still, the snow glinting beneath the moon. In homes up and down the street, families gathered around tables, laughter spilling through windows, prayers whispered, candles flickering. Different faces, different stories, but all of them in some way echoing that same eternal act, breaking bread, remembering mercy, giving thanks. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the frosted glass. Anna set the journal back on the mantel, where it caught the light and glowed faintly gold as if warmed from within. Years from now someone else would open it. Another descendant. Another voice. The words might fade, the ink might crumble, but the meaning, never. For Thanksgiving, after all, was not born from abundance. It was born from endurance, from a woman who looked at a wild, uncertain world and still found the courage to say thank you. And so it continued, one generation to the next, one table to another, one gathering to the next. The seasons would change again. But gratitude, eternal and unbroken, would always find its way home.